Royal Hungary was a borderland where stress felt normal. Taxes, raids, and levies came like weather. The crown's reach was uneven, so local nobles filled the gaps with their own courts and armed men. When order depends on private power, a rumor can become a weapon. A great estate worked like a mini-government. Stewards tracked grain, labor, and rents and ledgers that mattered as much as swords. Keys and seals controlled access, and discipline kept the machine running. Elizabeth was born into a dynasty with allies and enemies across the region. A famous surname offered protection, but also made every scandal louder. In elite politics, reputation was currency, and everyone watched who was spending it. As a noblewoman, Elizabeth learned languages, accounting, and how to command a household. Servants learned a different curriculum: move fast, speak little, and avoid angering the wrong person. That ladder of power shapes everything that comes later. Church life set the moral calendar: confession, shame, forgiveness, gossip. When villagers felt something was wrong, the priest often heard it first. In a world without modern policing, moral talk could turn into public pressure. Frontier war made harshness feel ordinary. Soldiers marched through villages and suffering became familiar. In that environment, people were quicker to believe stories of cruelty inside a powerful household, even without clear proof. Chukditsa Castle sat above villages like a permanent reminder of rank. Height, gates, and locked corridors created distance, and distance creates mystery. When accusations appear, architecture becomes part of the story. Widowhood could give a noblewoman unusual autonomy. Elizabeth managed estates, staff, and her children's future, power that drew attention from creditors and officials. The question wasn't only what happened, but also who benefits if she falls. Here's the tiny titans rule: stories spread faster than paperwork, until paperwork starts. Once officials begin writing depositions, the rumor becomes a file, and the file demands an ending. From this point, the case is built step by step. Late 1610, Palatine George Thurzo moves from rumor to action. When he rides with guards and clerks toward Chuktis, the visit is already a signal. Authority is arriving. The big question becomes not just what is found, but how the case will be handled. Elizabeth's marriage to Ferenc Nadasti was a merger of land, status, and alliances. Dowries and heirs mattered as much as vows. In a fragile kingdom, family strategy could decide who survived the next crisis. Nadasdi spent long seasons on the Ottoman frontier, earning fame and hardening discipline. Letters and orders traveled back to the estate, and the household had to run without him. War doesn't stay at the border. It leaks into how power is enforced at home. An estate runs on scheduling: harvest, storage, transport, labor days. When something fails, blame falls downward. A strict household can feel normal, right up until the day it doesn't. For many families, sending a daughter into noble service meant hope, training, connections, maybe safety. It also meant distance from home and dependence on household rules. This pipeline explains why missing stories hit so hard, because families had few ways to ask questions. Early modern medicine mixed folk cures, humors, and prayer. Treatments could be rough, and later writers loved turning care into cruelty to make a better story. In this episode, we keep the frame tight: what is plausible and what is only allegation. Big estates carried debts, war costs, dowries, loans, obligations. Creditors prefer predictable outcomes, not scandals that complicate inheritance. Money doesn't prove conspiracy, but it does explain why powerful people cared about solving the problem cleanly. In aristocratic Europe, reputation could punish before courts did. Rumor traveled through visits, letters, and confession. Once the frame tilts, she's dangerous, neutral events start getting read as proof. In 1604, Ferenc Nadasti dies, and the estate loses its public male figurehead. Elizabeth becomes the central manager, powerful and exposed. Timing matters. The strongest wave of accusations grows in the years after this shift. Feudal law wasn't gender-neutral in practice. A widow who resisted outside control could be framed as disorderly. Thurzo's later role sits right inside this tension: state authority stepping into private noble space. By 1610, the case is no longer village talk, it's an administrative concern. Clerks pack documents, guards pack weapons, and the file gains momentum. Once the machine starts, people inside it begin adjusting their stories to survive it. The earliest accusations rarely begin in palaces. They begin in kitchens, barns, and churchyards. A parent notices a daughter not returning. A servant hears something behind a closed door. In a world with limited policing, rumor becomes the alarm system. When ordinary people wanted action, they wrote petitions. A petition is risky. It points toward a noble house. So the language is careful. Concern, missing, please investigate. Still, once written, it can be copied and used as leverage. Servants saw routines, but speaking was dangerous. A guard's presence could decide a sentence before any words were written. That makes early testimony fragile, hedged, secondhand, and shaped by fear. Among nobles, letters move faster than courts. A rumor repeated in high-status rooms becomes an open secret. Stewards spread information too, because money disputes love scandal. Early modern Europe used witchcraft as both belief and label. When a woman held unusual power, that label could attach easily. Even if a court wasn't prosecuting witchcraft, the language could still shape how people interpreted accusations. Rumor networks blur sources. My cousin said becomes everyone knows. As stories spread, details get sharper, even when evidence doesn't. Humans love patterns, and officials love patterns because patterns look like cases. Numbers feel measurable, so they sound convincing. But in many early modern cases, the biggest number is often the least secure. Once a large number is repeated by authority, it hardens into fact for generations. Estate disputes involve loans, inheritance, and control of heirs. If scandal weakens a house, it can justify intervention. That doesn't prove a plotted frame-up, but it explains why powerful officials handled the case at the top. By 1610, reports have accumulated enough that Thurzo can't ignore them without looking complicit. But prosecuting a countess openly risks noble backlash. So he chooses the era's compromise: investigate, contain, and end unrest. The instant a dossier exists, the story changes status. A file can be copied and summarized without nuance. It invites a solution because institutions dislike open-ended fear. From here on, even silence will be interpreted as evidence by somebody. Thurzo's investigation wasn't a modern police case with forensics. It was a political legal process meant to stop unrest. Clerks structured reality by what they wrote down and what they left out. Who gets questioned first shapes everyone questioned after. Witnesses learn what investigators care about and answer it toward it. In a fearful room, repeating someone else's story can feel safer than standing alone. Early modern law often treated pressure as normal. Even without visible violence, the threat of punishment could bend a statement. That's why historians ask, what did people say before the pressure rose? Good inquiry separates direct observation from rumor, but political cases resist that discipline. If the kingdom needs closure, rumor can be treated like corroboration. The temptation of a neat narrative is strong when order is the priority. A high noble is hard to put on a bench, associates or not. Arresting staff creates people who can be charged, questioned, and pressured into confessions. In status societies, punishment often flows downward to explain upward. While witnesses speak, elites negotiate. Who controls estates? Who guards heirs? How do you avoid scandal spilling onto other families? These questions shape the legal solution as much as testimony does. A raid is theater as well as procedure. Clerks pack papers because the raid must produce a record. Guards pack weapons because a castle is private territory with loyal men. Before any door opens, the state is already shaping the story. When Thurzo rides, he carries both law and leverage. He must look decisive to the public and cautious to the nobility. The raid can be framed as investigation while functioning as containment. Accounts of what was found differ, but one strategic fact is consistent. Officials entered the household space. The moment the state walks the corridor, private discipline becomes public concern. Servants watch, knowing their survival depends on which power wins. An investigation can chase truth or chase an ending institutions can live with. The record suggests a process moving toward a managed conclusion. Preserve order, protect elites, satisfy outrage. When those goals align, the legend becomes inevitable. A great household runs on routine. Candles, water, keys, silence. A raid breaks routine, and everyone's first instinct is survival. Servants remember where they stood and who shouted, because those details decide blame. Thurso meets Elizabeth, and the clash is jurisdiction as much as morality. Clerks stand close, because every word must become a record. The paradox is sharp. She is powerful enough to matter, and too powerful to be tried openly. Early modern searches rarely produce forensic proof. They produce objects, rooms, and impressions. A locked door or a frightened servant can become evidence in story form, especially when investigators arrive expecting to find something. The fastest way to move a case is to arrest people who cannot resist legally. Servants and aides become the state's handle on the household. Once arrested, fear and hope of mercy shape what they will say next. Interviews begin while shock is fresh, memories vivid but unstable. Clerks ask structured questions that turn messy life into neat categories. Witnesses learn what kind of answer is safe very quickly. Confession was the era's shortcut. It could bundle years of rumor into one neat narrative, but it also reveals what interrogators believed before the confession existed, because people confess into the shape they're pushed toward. News spreads in the easiest shape. Wicked noble, innocent victims, hidden rooms. Sermons and village talk translate a legal file into moral certainty. Once the crowd locks on to certainty, nuance starts to look like betrayal. A public trial of a countess risks exposing other noble households and setting precedents elites fear. It also risks requiring proof the file can't deliver cleanly. Confinement is the era's status solution. Decisive, quiet, legally flexible. Elizabeth is confined, punished by architecture, not by courtroom. The state solves the case without proving it publicly. For enemies, it's victory. For allies, it's containment. For the public, it feels like confirmation. After the raid, the case becomes paperwork and precedent. Statements are copied and summarized, sometimes losing nuance and gaining certainty. The growing file becomes the seed of a growing myth. In 1611, the people around Elizabeth are tried while she is not. The court can punish visible bodies while protecting elite stability. To the public, that feels like justice, even if the center stays untouched. Punishment is easiest on those with no alliances. Once servants are sentenced, many assume the mastermind is proven. But that leap is social, not legal. The system gets closure without testing the central case in public. Confinement trades transparency for stability. It protects the kingdom from noble courtroom warfare and protects elites from precedent. Legends thrive in this trade because unanswered questions invite imagination. The practical questions keep moving. Who controls estates, debts, and heirs? Seals and ledgers decide daily reality more than dramatic accusations. Scandal makes rearranging power easier because resistance looks immoral. The famous enormous number appears in contested or late sources. Big numbers survive because they're memorable and because they justify why officials acted. The historian's question is simple. Where did it come from, and who repeated it first? Depositions disagree on dates, methods, and locations. That doesn't automatically erase everything, but it shows fear and memory at work. Investigators can treat contradictions as noise or as proof of hiding, depending on what they need. Trying a high noble publicly risks turning court into a battlefield between families. It invites retaliation and exposes other households. Containment ends the case without teaching the public that elites can be prosecuted the same way. Elizabeth dies in confinement in 1614. Paperwork can close the case, but culture doesn't. Her death removes the possibility of public defense, freezing the story in the shape others choose to tell. When a case ends without an open trial, imagination fills the gap. Villages keep telling the story because it explains fear and warns about elite power. Officials are done, communities are not. That mismatch births myth. With the accused dead and the file sealed, the story becomes available to anyone. Later writers add motifs that feel satisfying, even if thin. The record becomes the skeleton. The legend becomes the flesh. Archives preserve words. Communities preserve images. Over time, images win. Locked rooms, pale candles, vanished girls. The story becomes portable, told in any town with any castle, because folklore survives by adapting. The famous bathing in blood to stay young motif fits Gothic fiction perfectly. It is widely considered a later embellishment, rather than a core court claim. Motifs attach because they explain why in one shocking image. Early modern Europe had its own media system: sermons, letters, pamphlets, travelers' tales. Each layer amplifies what is sensational and simplifies what is complex. Rumor becomes reported, and reported becomes truth. Monster stories convert diffuse fear into one villain. They make structural exploitation feel like personal evil, which is emotionally satisfying, but it also hides the system that allowed harm in the first place. A powerful woman in a patriarchal order is easy to paint as unnatural or secretive. Legends use these anxieties because the audience is already primed. That doesn't prove innocence or guilt, but it explains why extreme versions spread faster. Most alleged victims were low-status girls, the least documented people in the archive. Folklore often erases them entirely, keeping only the Countess's name. Responsible retelling keeps focus on what power does to the powerless, not spectacle. Over centuries, the Báthory story gets reused for moral lessons, nationalist narratives, tourism, and horror. Each reuse selects facts to keep and doubts to discard. When a story becomes reusable, it becomes about the audience's needs. Huge numbers spread because they're memorable, but early modern counting was messy. Sickness, migration, rumor, missing persons, all blur together. The bigger the number, the more important it is to ask where it started. Once the legend is famous, it begins to rewrite the past. Later readers assume the most dramatic version must be the original one. But the surviving record is quieter, messier, and full of incentives that don't fit a clean horror script. Myths form when an event meets incentives that reward exaggeration. The shocking version spreads farthest, becomes default memory, and shapes everything after. In the final act, we return to the evidence and ask what can be said responsibly. This case doesn't allow perfect certainty. Skepticism isn't a defense of the Countess, it's a defense of method. We weigh claims by proximity, consistency, and incentive, not by how shocking they sound. We lack many private letters and local registers that would clarify what happened. What survives is filtered through power: officials, nobles, courts. Silence can be created by loss, fear, or deliberate removal, so certainty has limits. Containment served multiple interests: public calm, elite stability, property control. Thurzo could act without risking a noble courtroom war. Families could preserve heirs and avoid precedent while sacrificing associates. Incentives don't prove invention, but they explain the shape of the outcome. The safest conclusion is narrow. Serious abuse allegations existed, and deaths were alleged within the household sphere. The most cinematic claims, perfect motifs, perfect numbers, are the least secure. The messiness of the record reflects a messy process. The lowest status people are easiest to erase in legend, so we avoid the Gothic shortcut. If harm occurred, it happened to real girls with real families, not props in a horror story. Serious history doesn't need shock to be serious. The story endures because it bundles anxieties: class power, gender suspicion, secrecy, and the fear of elites. It has a castle, a countess, and missing people, folklore's favorite ingredients. When the official process ends without public closure, invention rushes in. Reality is usually less tidy than legend. The myth offers a simple villain. The record offers a system, hierarchy, coercion, rumor, and politics. The honest answer can be uncomfortable because it refuses a clean ending. When a story gets repeated, repetition can masquerade as proof. That's how everyone knows becomes "it must be true." Learning to spot that process here helps you spot it in many other famous legends. Chakti remains on the hill, and the legend keeps circling it. The stones don't speak, people do. In history, places often become screens where societies project their fears. Tiny Titans takeaway. History is not only what happened, it's how stories get built. In the Báthory case, a stressed society, unequal justice, and rumor networks created a legend that outlived the file. Follow the evidence, notice the incentives, and you'll start seeing how many monsters are really systems wearing a face.